This series of classes will be based on Chuck Smith's book, Calvary Chapel Distinctives. The introduction to the book contains a short little chapter called Call to the Ministry. Now, why is this chapter here? Though the Jesus movement gets started at Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa back in the late 60s and the early 70s, by the mid-1990s, the Calvary Chapel movement had a surge in churches asking to be affiliated with Calvary Chapel of Costa Mesa. In 1994, the year that our church, Calvary Chapel of Fullerton, started, over 750 churches were either planted or became associated with Calvary Chapel. That kind of growth in the movement brought problems. Over the next couple of years, it became obvious that some of these churches didn't quite pass the smell test of Calvary Chapel. They were close, but something was a little off. And so this book was that's the impetus behind the development of the book known as Calvary Chapel Distinctives. Even though all McDonald's don't look alike, there's enough similarity in all of them that when you walk into a McDonald's, you know what to expect. Well, Chuck had a desire that the same principle would apply to Calvary Chapel. There needed to be some common ground, areas with which all affiliated Calvary Chapels had in agreement. The Distinctives is that common ground. So, in a sense, the primary aim of this book is aimed at those leading these churches. It's aimed at pastors, and it's aimed at the very core of what we might, what it means to be a pastor, of what we call the call to the ministry. Is a man in the ministry because it's what his family decided? Is a man in the ministry because he's cool and he tells good stories? Is a man in the ministry because the board of some denomination or church has decided he's smart enough? Or is a man in the ministry because he has a great love for Jesus and has sensed a deep call in his heart from God to serve him? This class will be helpful to any person interested in knowing more about Calvary Chapel. And though not all have sensed a call by God into full-time ministry, there may be a few of you who have been wondering if indeed God may be calling you to serve him. So let's take a few minutes and listen to Pastor Chuck talk about his own call to the ministry. This clip is from an interview that Greg Laurie did with Chuck back in 2013.
So, okay, tell us now about the call to ministry. When did that happen? When you felt called to actually go into full-time preaching? Look at this picture of you preaching. You look like Charlton Heston here. I love this shot. Man, I miss having hair, don't you?
Yes.
You know, hair was good.
It was, yeah.
But you know, they say grass doesn't grow in busy streets, right? So tell me about your call to ministry, Chuck.
Well, actually, Greg, I was studying to be a medical doctor.
You're going to be a doctor? You would have been a great doctor, I think.
Well, I would have had a lot of compassion, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In fact, that's, I think, what was in my heart,
Yeah.
helping people.
Helping people.
I just had that, and I figured, that as a successful doctor, I could be a great layman in some church and just, help support and just serve the Lord in that capacity. And I was living in Santa Ana at the time, and the pastor came up one Sunday and said, there's a lady in the church that has paid a sponsorship for someone to go to the youth camp, and why don't you go? And I said, well, I had plans to go to Corona Del Mar and surf, and so, but...
Now, what year was this?
Oh my, this was about 1940. 43, 44, somewhere in there. And
so you had plans to go to the beach, but they go to a camp instead.
That's summer,
Of course.
Corona Del Mar.
I understand. And I think that was before the jetty was there, so the waves were bigger.
No, the jetty was there.
Was there way back then?
Yeah, we used to watch for the end of the jetty when the waves were, up the end, out at the end when they were up high on the, we would all head into the water, to catch those waves.
Yeah.
And so I was I went on up to this summer camp, and the speaker at the camp was a very inspiring fellow. And he made the statement, you have only one life, it will soon be past. And only what's done for Christ will last. And it just hit me. I thought, and so that afternoon I was out under a big pine tree and just my Bible and just thinking about one life, it'll soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. And so I felt the Lord speaking to my heart and saying, look, you can go ahead and become a doctor and you can help people physically and you can help them for a time, but they're all going to die. But if you will devote your life to helping people spiritually, then you're going to help them eternally. Now, do you want to give your life for something that is temporal or something that is eternal? And I couldn't argue with that. And so that was where I felt the Lord was calling me to go to Bible college. And so I figured when I went home and told my mom that I wasn't going to be a doctor, I was going to go to Bible college instead of USC. And she said, well, son, if that's what you feel the Lord is calling you to do, that's wonderful. I didn't know that she had made this promise to the Lord when my sister was dying, that if the Lord would just bring her back to life, she would serve him and so forth. And that when I was born, she said, Lord, I'll fulfill it through my son. She didn't tell me that. I didn't know that until she was on her deathbed. And then she told me, she said she didn't want that to influence me. She wanted it to be the Lord.
Her heart must have just leapt with joy when you told her that. Imagine.
Yeah. And I thought, she's so cool, I thought she...
She was. To keep that all those years.
Charles Spurgeon was a famous pastor in the last half of the 19th century. His church in London seated over 10,000 people. He preached to huge crowds in a day where there's no microphones or PA systems. He also had a school to train men into ministry called his pastor's school. I would encourage any of you who are looking to go into the ministry to consider picking up a copy of Spurgeon's book. It's called Lectures to My Students. He has a chapter titled The Call to the Ministry, and Spurgeon says that a pastor's call ought to show these four things. First, an intense, all-absorbing desire for the work. Number two, an aptness to teach. You've got to be able to teach the Scriptures. Number three, he must have a measure of conversion work going on under his efforts. And number four, his preaching should be acceptable to the people of God. People don't mind listening to him. While we often talk about how God uses the foolish things to confound the wise, and that God can use anyone as long as they're wholly devoted to the Lord, there is another side to consider. Spurgeon talks about how God wants the very best men in the ministry. He writes this, "One brother I have encountered, one, did I say? I have met 10, 20, 100 brethren who have pleaded that they are sure, quite sure that they were called to the ministry. They were quite certain of it because they had failed in everything else. This is a sort of model story. Sir, I was put into a lawyer's office, but I never could bear the confinement, and I could not feel at home in studying law. Providence clearly stopped up my road, for I lost my situation. And what did you do then? Why, sir, I was induced to open a grocer's shop. And did you prosper? Well, I do not think, sir, I was ever meant for trade, and the Lord seemed quite to shut up my way there, for I failed and was in great difficulties. Since then, I have done a little life insurance agency, and I tried to get up a school besides selling tea, but my path is hedged up, and something within me makes me feel I ought to be a minister. My answer generally is, yes, I see. You have failed in everything else, and therefore you think the Lord has especially empowered you for his service. But I fear you have forgotten that the ministry needs the very best of men, and not those who cannot do anything else. A man who would succeed as a preacher probably would do right well either as a grocer or a lawyer or anything else. A really valuable ministry would have excelled at anything. There is scarcely anything impossible to a man who can keep a congregation together for years and be the means of edifying them over hundreds of consecutive Sabbaths, he must be possessed of some abilities and be by no means a fool nor a ne'er-do-well. Jesus Christ deserves the best man to preach his cross, and not the empty-headed and shiftless. Now, one of the reasons it's important to have a sense that God has called you is because you will find in any ministry that there will be times of great discouragement. I've been in some sort of ministry since 1976 and have gone through many, many times of wondering why I should spend my life enduring such trials. The thing that has kept me from leaving is knowing that God is the one who has called me. My call to the ministry came during a time of sorrow. It was after my senior year in high school, and like Chuck, I was going to spend a week in the mountains at a summer youth camp at Forest Home near Idlewild. And best of all, my girlfriend of 8 months, I knew she was the one, I was dating her for 8 months, she was going to go as well, except she broke up with me on Monday, the second day of camp. I was devastated. I remember crying that night with my pastor and struggling with even wanting to be at the camp where I would have to be around this gal for the whole next week. But in my sadness, God had my attention. He had taken away the one thing that would keep me from hearing him. During all the Bible studies that week, I could sense God moving and speaking to me. I spent time looking back at my last 2 years of high school and how God had used me as one of those Jesus freaks in the early Jesus movement. On Thursday night of the camp, an old retired pastor was speaking to this group of 300 high school students. His name was Earl Riley. He's a tall, lanky man from Arizona. And though his topic that night was about missions, he really was talking about serving God. As old Earl spoke, I began to realize that the things that God had been doing in my life over the last few years, it all made sense. God had been using me both at school and at church. At school, I was a guy that God used to reach other kids for Christ. I was a kid learning apologetics and debating the atheist teachers in English and history class. At church, I was a part of the youth choir, and we not only sang at our church, but we toured all over California and neighboring states, sharing our testimonies, praying with members of the congregations. Oh my gosh, what a time it was. I realized at that camp that the greatest thing I could do with my life was serving Jesus. And though I wasn't aware of it at the time, I can see now that all the things that Spurgeon talked about also applied to me. In some 50 years since I've been doing ministry, I've had plenty of times of discouragement where I wanted to quit. But I have always kept going because I know that God has called me and I want to be faithful to him. So, for some of you, this is something you need to think about. I can't tell you the exact steps you're going to need to take, but perhaps God would ask you today to give yourself to him afresh and to ask him to lead you in preparation to be used more and more by him. I hope you've found this helpful.